This is a CBC podcast.
More First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children are in foster care right now than there ever were during the height of the residential school system. It's a stat that is cited often when talking about the foster care system. And it's what former Nunavut MP Mumilak Kokquak has called the modern-day residential school system. But to understand where we are, we have to understand how we got here. CBC Radio's Kyle Musica brings part one of a 5-part series on Indigenous child welfare in Canada.
At the height of the residential school system, stats kept by what was then known as Indian and Northern Affairs showed just under 12,000 children were at residential schools in the late 1950s. According to the 2016 census, the last data that's available, around 15,000 Indigenous children are in foster care. Of the children under 15 in foster care today, more than half of them are Indigenous, despite only making up 7.7% of the total population in Canada. It's a problem that is simultaneously focused on and overlooked. To understand the modern-day residential school system, we have to understand the history that got us here.
Well, it all begins with the savage and civilized dichotomy. And that really underpins everything to do with colonialism.
That's Cindy Blackstock. She's from the Gitxsan First Nation, and she's the executive director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society.
There's a presumption that everything that Western society has to offer is civilized, and everything that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples are and have been and will be is savage. That allows for the dehumanization of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. And it also gave it the modus operandi of dispossessing us of the lands because we weren't capable of managing them, and the resources, and also the children, that you were bringing them up to standard by civilizing them.
This presumption started at contact. Settlers hunted the buffalo, a main food source, to near extinction. They spread viruses and disease to communities. They pushed Indigenous people off very desirable lands near rivers and lakes to more isolated areas, which were sometimes flood-prone and resource-poor. Gabrielle Fayant is a co-founder of the Assembly of Seven Generations, a youth-focused nonprofit organization in Ottawa. She's originally from the Fishing Lake Métis settlement in Alberta.
One of the easiest ways that colonizers believed that they could steal the land is by removing the children from their families and removing Indigenous peoples from their homelands and their culture and breaking their languages and governance systems and completely assimilating Indigenous children into white society.
This was achieved first through industrial schools, then through residential schools, then through day schools and convents. The trauma felt from loss of land, language, community, and culture pushed Indigenous people to coping mechanisms. And there were people who spoke out against the schools at the time, but the government pushed on. The schools didn't assimilate Indigenous people into Canadian society as well as the federal government hoped. So they tried something else.
Canadians see the, quote, drunk Indian on the streets. They see, quote, the drunk Indian not working, and this is an issue for their society. And so Canada then begins another process, the 60 Scoop, to save children from the drunk Indian, now no longer the savage Indian, but the drunk Indian.
That's Blake Desjardins. He's Métis from the Fishing Lake Métis settlement as well. He's the MP for Edmonton-Griesbach, and he's the former Director of Public and National Affairs for the Métis Settlements General Council. His mother was a part of the 60s Scoop, an organized effort by governments to take Indigenous children from their families and adopt them into non-Indigenous families.
Canada starts to provide funding to the provinces for the 60s Scoop. In many ways, the federal government doubles its efforts and now has provincial governments taking children at a mass rate. So children apprehension skyrocket through the roof, and we see a whole new generation of Indigenous people went through a terrible form of atrocity, not necessarily by the schools, by regular Canadians, where they would face very similar disenfranchisement from their culture, very similar identity issues, and oftentimes the same types of abuses, whether it be emotional, physical, or sexual abuse that they faced in the residential schools, these children now face in private homes.
Desjardins briefly experienced the foster care system himself. He considers himself lucky. He was legally adopted by his aunt, but his 3 siblings were adopted out. One lives in Quebec and speaks only French. Another died before he ever got the chance to really know her. and the other is incarcerated. When his biological mother died, Desjardins found out he was named next of kin, and he found a notebook where his mom wrote about how she felt like she was a failure. It's what has inspired him to fight for the children in care today.
And I always think of all the other mothers and fathers who had lost their children, who had never got that moment to hear from them, their own children, is probably the hardest part in that story, knowing that she thought she was a bad person because of the life they took from her. And that breaks my heart.
Desjardins and his family are living examples of what these colonial policies have done to Indigenous people and how they continue to affect them today. In his work, Desjardins has investigated deaths of Indigenous children in care. And while he notes there are some folks who have had positive experiences with the foster care system, there are many who have not. All these traumas, up to the Millennium Scoop today, have contributed to a massive overrepresentation of Indigenous children in the foster care system.
To come from a certain history that is so influenced by an external force that has now forced you into an oppressed systems and keeps you there, what exactly does that look like and how do you explain that is really difficult and complex. And at the same time, it's not.
That's Mumalak Kakak, who is Inuk and is the former MP for Nunavut.
It's a lack of respect and dignity in a relationship between one human being and another. And that creation of power imbalance has continued to allow Inuit and Indigenous people throughout Canada continue to die unnecessarily.
While the foster care system is just one result of this colonial history, all of it is connected. And it's a history Kakak says Canadians need to understand much better before we can go any further. For CBC Radio, I'm Kyle Musica.
Thank you, Kyle. Kyle will be back tomorrow with another segment in this series. In the meantime, a National Indian Residential School Crisis Line has been set up to provide support for residential school survivors and others affected. People can call the 24-hour National Crisis Line, 1-866-925-4419.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.